We are at carbmatics.com. We're looking at just a small article. It says same species versus interfertile. Concise wording can avoid confusion when discussing evolution. It is an unfortunate quirk of our language that the word species, like many similar words, has two different meanings. An absolute one, referring to membership in a named set of items, and a relative one, referring to the relationship between two individual items, independent of naming. This is mostly a problem when used within an expression like A and B are the same species. Sometimes the differences are subtle, but sometimes they are profound. The problem is much greater if the individuals in question live during different time periods. I believe this ambiguity contributes to a huge amount of confusion among those who struggle to grasp evolution, and that many concepts can become much clearer in a single change of terminology. I suggest that we avoid the confusion altogether. Instead of saying A and B are the same species, we can say A and B are interfertile. Interfertile is always a relative term, and thus appropriate for explaining evolution. Before delving into the differences between absolute and relative, and the logical errors that result from mixing the two meanings, let me go ahead and define interfertile in the most concise way I can possibly say. Note that I have restricted the discussion to animals, but I can apply to other organisms as well as long as they sexually reproduce. Interfertile. Two animals are interfertile if they would be able to produce an offspring if they were allowed to mate or were artificially inseminated. If they both are the same sex, they are interfertile if they can produce an offspring with the appropriate sex parent of the other. If they are both the same sex, they are both interfertile if they can produce an offspring with the appropriate sex parent of the other. Of course, a key phrase is, in quotes, if they were allowed to mate or were artificially inseminated, in quotes, what if they were allowed to mate or were artificially inseminated? It's just saying if they were allowed to do that, end quote. What if one animal lived 1,000 years prior to another? What if they lived thousands of miles apart in the distant past when humans weren't around to transport them around and test it? The simple answer is it's hypothetical. If it helps to visualize scientists traveling around in a time machine and collecting sperm and using it to artificially inseminate animals of different time periods, well, do what you have to do. Note that in some cases, interfertile differs somewhat from your usage of expression same species. For instance, a coyote is not considered the same species as a gray wolf, yet it is interfertile with the wolf. This difference should not be a problem, and in almost all cases of discussion of evolution, interfertile will be the better choice. It will be more concise, less ambiguous, and less subject to arbitrary human decisions. Also, you'll notice the definition I provided does not have the qualification that the offspring be fertile, as that would introduce a whole new set of ambiguities. Fertile meaning it can reproduce with any existing animal or any hypothetical animal. Does its offspring have to be fertile as well? Absolute versus relative. It's all about the transitive property. Consider the word neighborhood, another word with both absolute and relative meanings. With the absolute meaning, there are a fixed number of discrete neighborhoods in a city, each of which has a name, and every person lives in exactly one neighborhood. In this sense, the word is equivalent to words like county, state, and country. Thus, the transitive property will apply. If A lives in the same neighborhood as B and B lives in the same neighborhood as C, then A must live in the same neighborhood as C. Meanwhile, the relative meaning simply indicates the area close to a given location. It is roughly equivalent to saying part of town or the colloquial neck of the woods. With the relative term, there are essentially an infinite number of neighborhoods and they overlap one another. Importantly, the transitive property does not apply. Just because A and B are in the same neighborhood and B and C are in the same neighborhood, we cannot assume that A and C are in the same neighborhood. The more degrees of separation, the less likely it is for them to be in the same neighborhood. If we need a non-ambiguous way of saying that Dave and Mary live within a close walk of one another, we are in luck. We can simply say Dave and Mary are neighbors. Problem solved. Neighbor is always a relative term. With the term species, the same situation applies. When speaking only of currently living organisms, the difference between the two meanings of same species can be subtle and doesn't usually lead to confusion. Ring species being a notable exception, see the sidebar, we'll check that out. When talking about evolution, we often need to discuss the relationships between organisms that are separated by time. For instance, a present-day animal and its ancestor that lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. Here, the difference between the two meanings of the term becomes critically important. If we need a non-ambiguous, always relative term to indicate same species degree of relatedness between two organisms, interfertile is probably the best one we've got. The absolute definition of species, where there are a fixed number of taxonomic species, each organism belonging to exactly one, can be convenient for categorization, but it generally fails for explaining the logic of evolution. It doesn't map directly to the real world, just as named neighborhoods with hard boundaries don't tend to accurately describe real properties of cities. Trying to interpret the expression same species in its absolute meaning when the relative meaning is the appropriate one can lead to worlds of confusion and apparent logic contradictions. Remember that with an absolute definition, the transitive property will apply. If organism A is the same species as organism B and B is the same species as C, then A must be the same species as C. Now combine that with the obviously true fact that an organism must always be the same species as its parents, it becomes easy to see how someone would find evolution to not make logical sense. Right, because evolution doesn't make sense. We get questions like why no one has ever observed one animal giving birth to an animal of another species. The problem, of course, is that they were basing their logic on two different meanings of the word species. I'm not going to break this article down. I'm just going to keep reading. If someone insists on using the absolute definition, they should use it consistently and accept that a parent can be from a different taxonomic species from its offspring, just as someone can be in a different neighborhood can be in a different named neighborhood than someone who is 20 feet away. But a better solution is to simply stick with the relative meaning, or better yet, use the word interfertile when trying to explain or understand the logic of evolution. Typical questions from people confused about the concept of species. The following questions and complaints come from people with profound misunderstanding of the concept of species and speciations, much of which can be addressed by clarifying the difference between absolute and relative meanings. In each case, it is clear that there is a view of species that is closer. In each case, it is clear there is a view of species that is closer to the absolute meaning, that a species represents a single kind or type, and as hard edges like the hard edge neighborhoods drawn on the map above. These questions and complaints have all been addressed by others, and yet people struggle with them. In the near future, I will write a short article addressing each of them using the concept of interfertility rather than that of species. If humans evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? If one species can evolve from another, we should have seen an animal give birth to an animal of a different species. This is all logical. That's all logical. That's not illogical. Right on. Why does the first animal of a new what does the first animal of a new species mate with? We've never seen a transitional species. Microevolution, adapt, change within type might be possible, but there is no evolution of macroevolution, changing of a type to a new type, changing of a type to a new type. So hold on. Once again, because the article's almost over, he's trying to say that the people don't make sense by asking those kinds of questions, but you can't have sex with the monkey and make it, right on? And they can argue, oh, all these guys are dead and they no longer exist. So how are the people still here? That doesn't make sense. Here we go. Reading the last part. Tips for those teaching, explaining, debating evolution. Refer people to this webpage. And make sure they understand the difference between absolute and relative. Concentrating first on neighborhoods, a subject with less complexities and emotional baggage than biology. It's not emotional baggage. It's just what it is, y'all. You see what I'm saying? You see how he tried to put the emotional term there? That has nothing to do with science. So why would you even say that? Let me just keep going. 2, avoid the term species whenever possible. Rather than saying A and B are the same species, say A and B are genetically similar enough to successfully interbreed if given a chance. Or, of course, you may simply shorten it to A and B are interfertile. Again, refer to this page to see a concise definition of interfertile. 3. When someone who is questioning evolution uses the term species, ask which meaning they are using, or simply, that's called freaking Socratic questioning. Anyway, ask them, or simply ask them to use a more logically concise way of expressing what they mean, such as the word interfertile. Remind people that while humans have a tendency to categorize things and assign words to them, these often arbitrary decisions cannot be used to support any assertion about things that they refer to. For instance, no scientist would attempt to support a hypothesis concerning Pluto based on whether or not humans have chosen to categorize it as a planet. I don't know if that's true or not. We'll move on. Number 5, if something that seems obvious and intuitive to you seems to confuse people, it seems to confuse someone else, chalk this up to variation within a population rather than a malice or stupidity. Have patience. Some people prefer clear delineation between types and just aren't comfortable with shades of gray and blurry boundaries. There are many advantages to their way of viewing things as well. They might make good librarians or politicians, for instance, but it just doesn't work well for understanding evolution. Oh my goodness. Finally done reading this shit. This was made in 2007 by this guy named Rob Brown. Don't worry, I'm not going to throw Rob under the bus, but Rob doesn't know what he's talking about on a lot of different levels. Excuse me. To compare a neighborhood, thank you. To compare a neighborhood to genetics would be like essentially comparing flour to metal. The two things just are not the same. They're totally different. And even if you try to formulate something, you can't eat metal and live on that. It's not happening. But you can eat flour and live on that. You see what I'm talking about? You don't mate with your neighborhood, okay? You don't lay on the ground and create babies by living. See, so that's an illogical way of doing things. And that right there was his attempt of trying to shift the argument, because it's very logical for people to say, well, if these things were so-called interfertile, scientists argue that all the ancestors of these things were killed off and this is why they no longer make it like this. But that doesn't make sense. How are these things still around? How did they live and the other things die off? And that's where they come from. But yet people still look like the same way people looked thousands of years ago. Right. Some people look totally different. However, this is all about genetics. If you don't believe that people crawled out the middle of this planet with horse legs and goat legs and half fish bodies, or swam out the middle of the planet, man, can't wait. Can't wait. Anyway, doesn't matter what I say. What I say doesn't matter. I appreciate your time there, my people. Hopefully this one permeates a little bit better than the last few have. Seems like I'm not doing my job. So I'll do better.